Hey guys, John Paulamy here, Actionable Intelligence. Today is Saturday, June 29th, 2019. I'm going to veer a little bit into the political realm, and please, all the gamma ankle biters out there, don't email me, don't go into the messages. This applies to all politicians, but I think that it needs to be discussed because I think that the things that are going to be happening politically over the next year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years are definitely going to have an effect on investing and speculating, especially as it relates to some of the sectors we're involved with. So, kicking this off, here is the second Democratic debate that happened the other day. And you'll note we don't have all of the Dumbos on here just because there's so many of them, but the point is being made here. You know that they all have their hands raised. The reason they have their hands raised is because they were asked a question, group question. How many of you on the dais support giving medical care, free medical care to illegal or undocumented illegal aliens, however you want to characterize them, basically illegal aliens. And of course, they all raised their hand up. You can see Joe Biden there tentatively raising his hand. He had to be asked if he was asking a question or if he was agreeing with this. But basically, they all want to give free medical care to all the people that are coming into the country from all over Central America and Mexico illegally. They also, a large majority of them want open borders. These people are insane. But the point I'm trying to make is that they want to spend a lot of money. If you listen to them, we want to forgive college debt. We want free health care, Medicare for all. All these different plans and programs, and just bewildering. It was just like a candy store, sugar high, trying to one-up each other on who could give away more of your money. Because, we're already running trillion-dollar deficits. Now, Trump is not off the hook. Trump and the Republicans passed a massive tax cut that's not paid for, and they increased spending $300 billion this year. That's one of the reasons why we're not in a recession. So this is all tying together. This will tie together. I'm just, whether you're Republican or Democrat or whatever you consider yourself, I pox on all these people's houses. But what I wanted to do is take you down the trail here. So of course, these people on the stage, they're going to have the wealthy and corporations pay their fair share. But here's something interesting that you probably may not have known, is that half of the taxpayers pay 95% of all income taxes. Half the people out there don't even pay any income taxes. As a matter of fact, the bottom 50% of taxpayers only pay 3% of the taxes. So what I never can get out of any of these people is, well, how much tax should people pay? Now, we've heard, a marginal tax rate of 70% from, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I don't like her. I think she's a goofball, but she's at least honest. She'll tell you what she wants to do. What I'm trying to get at here is there's not enough money to pay for all this stuff. There's not enough money to pay for the things that we've already on the hook for, Social Security, Medicare, the debt, Veterans Affairs, all the people that we've butchered up and destroyed their bodies. We have to pay for that. All the other things that we're on the hook for, we can't afford. There's not a lot of juice to squeeze out of the taxpayers. You can try to raise taxes, you can try to do things, but basically you can get about, anywhere from 17 to 20% of the GDP you can get out of the taxpayers. So I guess we could, raise money on we could raise taxes on corporations. I never really understood how dull people are in their head. If you raise taxes on a company like, let's just use a company like Procter and Gamble, for example, the people that make Tide and Downy and, your toilet paper and crap like that, stuff that you use every day. Why would you raise taxes on them? Who do you think actually pays the taxes? If the costs in a corporation are raised, guess what they do? Whether they're taxes, input costs, energy costs, They pass them on to the consumer, you, the buyer. No one figured this out yet? No one understands this? Well, we're just going to, because they're not paying their fair share either. Okay, great. So anyway, moving on. What I'm trying to make the point to you here is that a lot of promises are being made that can't be paid for. But we have a solution. And Ray Dalio, the hedge fund manager, has been talking about this. And I thought it would be interesting to go over his solution because he's a very smart guy. But this is an example of an idiot savant that doesn't really, it's not street smart. You can tell. Now, I'll put a link to the article where he's talking about this, but I want to go over what he's talking about because this is actually what I think is going to end up happening over the next years as we go forward. It's inevitable just because of the moral breakdown of the country and the average American just being, a sloth. This is where we're heading. Bastiat, French economist back in the 1700s, talked about this, how people would get in their idea in their head that they would be able to live off their neighbor by, going to the voting booth. But Ray Dalio's talking about monetary policy 3, version 3, and how that is coordinated with modern monetary theory. And it's a very good article, actually. It's historical. This is not the first time we've had, MMT and these type of monetary policies. You go back to World War II, that's how it was financed. But we'll get into where we're going, where we're heading here. Basically, you can see the politics is out there that there's a lot of unrest. There's a lot of people that feel like they got the short end of the stick. They're not participating in the economy. They're getting screwed over, whatever. And people vote. We live in a republic that has a democratic form of government, representative government, and when a large majority of the people want to try to live off their neighbor, they are able to go to the polls and do that. And you can see the pandering that goes to these type of people. A moral, a just, a historical people that we had in this country would never, ever think of taking something for nothing. Remember the movie with Russell Crowe when he was playing a boxer during the Depression, and he broke his hand, and he couldn't really work, and they were turning the heat off. He had little kids, the whole thing. I think it was called Cinderella Man. I can't remember. But anyways, basically he made a big comeback and became wealthy. But there's a poignant part of that story that tells you how people used to be in this country. Now, this is in the depths of the Depression. We had 30% unemployment. People were really, really hungry. There was really not a safety net. And, he was told to go get on welfare. And when he had to go down there and sign up for it, it was very embarrassing for a full-grown man, able-bodied man, even though he had a broke hand, to accept welfare. And the woman behind because he was a semi-famous boxer, the woman behind the counter said to him, I think his name was Jack, she said, "Gee, Jack, I never thought I'd see you down here, in line at the welfare office." And he was very shamed by this, as a majority of people back then would have been. Even if they were facing starvation, they still didn't want to accept something for nothing. Later on in the film, when he makes his comeback and becomes wealthy, he goes back and pays back the welfare office. Now, you won't ever see that happen here nowadays, but I'm getting off track. What I wanted to get onto is the fact that there's a lot of promises and a lot of money that wants to be spent, and there's a lot of disaffected people that want free shit. So, getting to Ray Dalio's Monetary Policy 3 and how that ties into MMT, Monetary Policy 1 was, just a lowering of interest rates. Several economic cycles going back 20 years, the historical interest rate, Fed funds rate would be up around 5 or 6% or maybe higher in some cases. And the Federal Reserve would go through a rate cutting cycle, lowering rates, 200-300 basis points, whatever, and that would be sufficient to stimulate the economy and allow for the economic recovery to take place. And that worked fine, but as the debts in the system increased and the malinvestments increased because of the intervention of the Fed into the market, short-circuiting the cleansing process that Joseph Schumpeter talked about, all these malinvestments in zombie companies, somehow a certain amount of them, it's like bacteria and antibiotics. If you overuse antibiotics, bacteria become numb to them. They become, where it doesn't kill them, and they become resistant. And therefore, They cannot be killed off. It's the same thing with monetary policy. You have to be careful that you let the cleansing system of capitalism get rid of the malinvestments in the companies that shouldn't exist or are mismanaged, and then let those things, rise on their own. But of course, politicians don't want to have to face the electorate. Somebody needs to do something. I'm laid off from the car factory, the steel mill, the whatever. Somebody needs to do something. So of course, they have fiscal spending on projects, and Federal Reserve lowers rates, blah, blah, blah. You go through cycle after cycle of this, and you cannot clear out the malinvestments in the crud. It's like underbrush being allowed to grow in a forest. So, once we've got rates down so low, they started trying to use quantitative easing. Quantitative easing is just where the Federal Reserve went in and bought Treasury securities, and in some cases, mortgage bonds, and some, like in Japan, just went out and started buying stocks, or the Swiss bank did the same thing. But this didn't benefit the average Joe Main Street. This benefited the financial players and the wealthy, people like myself that have financial assets. We benefited from these two policies. The average schmo that doesn't really have any money or have any investments doesn't benefit from this. So after 20 or 30 years of this cycling, especially after the dual bone-crushing financial things that happened in 2000 with the tech wreck, and then the housing bubble in 2008, the great financial crisis, most of middle America, of the shoe clerks and the bleacher bums and the regular Joes out there, Budweiser Bill and his buddies, they haven't benefited from any of this, and they're pissed off. And then you have these other groups that are marginalized groups, or groups that have never traditionally been able to participate in the so-called American dream, and they're really disaffected. And all of these people can vote. So what Ray Dalio was saying is, look, what's going to happen, and I agree with this. You can see it coming. The zeitgeist is changing. You're seeing a new crop of politicians come along, whether they're socialist, whatever you want to call them, Alexandria, Ocasio-Cortez and people like this. But these people are more, activist. They want to change things, radically change things. And this setup of Monetary Policy 3 and MMT is perfect for that type of political bent. These people are usually of color or some other marginalized group that already has a chip on their shoulder, and that coupled with the fact that they have not participated, at least in their view, or gotten what they think they should have gotten out of the so-called American economy, will lead to what I think is going to be a new policy regime. So basically, what Ray Dalio says is Monetary Policy 3 is the fiscal and monetary policy coordination that is a form that we haven't seen before in our lifetimes. And what that will entail is, instead of what the government will do is issue bonds to pay for things like infrastructure spending, the cancellation of student loans, the paying of free college, different programs, free health care, whatever, and the Federal Reserve will monetize the debt. There certainly won't be enough tax money to pay for it. Yes, there'll be tax increases, but as some wag that I know that's very wealthy said, they can raise taxes to 100, we'll figure a way around it. There's always a way around this stuff. So people will leave, they'll move, this will not be good economically, but what it will do is it'll be good politically. And I will attach an article that Ray Dalio talks about some of the mechanisms that can be used to actually, instead of funneling monies and currency units through printing of money and QE and lowering of rates to the financial sector, MP3 is going to funnel money and redistribute wealth to the middle and lower classes. That will be the intent. And there's mechanisms to do that. When he's talking about MMT, he says MMT's most important configuration is the fixing of interest rates at zero, and there is the strict controlling of inflation via the changing of physical policy surpluses and deficits, which will produce debt that central banks will monetize. Now, this stuff starts to get a little bit complicated. It's very easy to understand. When the economy's doing well, supposedly the theory will be that, we'll raise taxes and we will not have as big as budget deficits. And if the budget deficits we do have will be monetized, blah, blah, blah. The problem is when people like Ray Dalio and professors at universities start thinking up these things, they look at it like pulling lever. They look at it like a machine, a cause and effect machine. Well, you can push this button and this set of gears will turn, and then this knob over here, you pull this lever, and then this will happen. But that's not how it really works, because you're dealing with human beings, and human beings have they are flawed. All human beings are flawed, especially people that are in power. And so we get this statement from Ray Dalio that I think is where I start chuckling, where it shows that people aren't really street smart. They may be intellectually very capable and they can think theories up, but here's the downfall of this particular theory. The big risk of this approach arises from the risks of putting the power to create and allocate money, credit, and spending in the hands of politically elected policymakers. Oh boy. So here's where the problem is. You can look at Venezuela, you can look at Zimbabwe, you can look at portions of Eastern Europe after the fall of communism, you can look at Germany and the Weimar Republic. There's so many different inflations and politically motivated currency destructions that, there's a list of them on Wikipedia. You can go over them, and this is what's going to happen. If you had virtuous people, if you had people that only had the best interest of everybody else except for themselves at heart, then maybe, just maybe, these theories could be implemented properly, and maybe they could work. Maybe they could semi-work. But what's going to happen is once politicians, let's look at, somebody like Ocasio-Cortez. She wants to spend trillions of dollars on a Green New Deal. She wants free health care. She wants open borders. She wants people to come in. I just showed you that all the Democratic people running for president want open borders, and they said that they want free health care for everyone that crosses the border if they're an illegal alien. So, because, that's the compassionate thing to do, because they showed you a picture of a drowned father and his daughter, and that's supposed to, we're supposed to make policy based on that. Every second, two people die around the world. Are we supposed to mourn? 100 billion people have lived. Human beings have lived. We're all going to die. We're not getting out of here. So we're supposed to just mourn every sad sack story that happens and base policy on it. Well, I guess that's what we're going to do. It's going to cost a lot of money. We don't have it. Let's read this again, because this is the downfall of this policy. And the policy I imagine is going to be implemented. The big risk of this approach arises from the risks of putting the power to create and allocate money, credit, and spending in the hands of politically elected policymakers. Now, I ask you, dear listener, what is the main motivation of every single rotten little bedbug dipshit politician? It's not looking out for your interests. It's not doing the right thing. So make sure he or she gets reelected. Let me say that again. The major focus and job of these dirtbag politicians of both parties, I don't care who they are. They're all the same as far as I'm concerned, is to get reelected. How do you get reelected? By promising people goodies. And now you have a theory that's being put out by not only hedge fund managers, but people in academia that are giving them the permission, if you will, or the authorization or the sanction to move forward with just printing money. Because, hey, the people, it's the same thing. Who are you to say anything, John? You don't have a PhD in economics from Cal Berkeley. Shut your mouth. Okay, I guess I'll just sit here and buy hard assets and get wealthy. Let's go down what he says here later on. In my opinion, for these MP3 policies to work well, the system would have to be engineered. See, they use these type of words. Normal people don't talk like this. Would have to be engineered in a way that decision-making would be in the hands of wise, not politically motivated and highly skilled people. Is this guy for real? This guy manages hundreds of billions of dollars. Is he for real? Hey, stay in your own lane, Ray. You don't have a freaking clue how people really are on the street people, how people really act in the real world, not in the your little lounges in Boston University or in Harvard or in Cal Berkeley, where you guys sit around and think these things up. You give monetary policy to Maxine Waters, Ocasio-Cortez, any of those dipshits that are on that dais, and they're going to run the bill up, man. They're going to go nuts. It's going to be Hugo Chavez tried this. You know, he was going to be the savior of all the poor in Venezuela. You see what they're living through now. It's difficult to imagine how the system will be built to achieve that. Yeah, because you're talking about utopia. It ain't going to happen. At the same time, it is inevitable that we are heading this direction. And I actually agree with that. That's exactly where we're going. You can see how they're setting it up. They're setting it up, you know, the average person hasn't benefited. All the wealthy fat cats benefited from QE and previous monetary excursions. And I agree with that. That's exactly right. There was no way, if you didn't have money or financial assets, you were going to benefit from QE. That's exactly right. When people sell their bonds to the Federal Reserve, they take that money, they don't sit it and stuff it in a mattress. They don't go out and build new plant and equipment. They buy financial assets. That's why you've had inflation in stock prices and real estate prices, and that's why you have the bubble in everything, if you will. And it's going to get worse. So, you know, this is very dangerous. This is going to happen. This is what I've been thinking is going to happen. You can see the zeitgeist, this resurrection of MMT, the justification for it, how we can just print money and, you know, we can put certain restraints on it. I mean, this is right out of When Money Dies. This is exactly how the central bankers in Weimar Germany used to talk. You should read the book. They talk exactly like this. Because they're wise, and they just, you know, it's like Gideon Gono, you know, in Zimbabwe. He knew that printing money was going to cause a hyperinflation. Now, I'm not suggesting that this MP3 or MMT is going to cause hyperinflation. What it is going to do is cause dislocate. I don't know what kind of dislocations. It depends how far they take it. And let's not let President Trump off the hook. He's an MMTer all the way. He doesn't give a rat's ass about that deficit or the federal debt. He runs the country, he runs the federal government in 15-minute ahead increments. Whatever's good between this tweet and the next tweet is good enough for me, because he wants to stay in power. You know, now, you know, that's what this is all about, okay? Not making your life better. Did anybody else take basic economics in high school or college? I mean, you know, what is inflation? It's printing currency units. You know, the Japanese have been doing it for years, you know, and as long as the money's not transmitted to the real economy, but once that starts happening, which is, I believe, is what is going to end up happening, then you're really going to see the real price of goods inflation. Let me take you way back. This is Milton Friedman. He's a Nobel Prize winning economist. He was an advocate for capitalism and free markets. And I want to play this short video clip when he was on the Donahue show. A lot of you younger guys won't know this super liberal goofball Phil Donahue used to have a talk show, and he'd bring people on. But this is like a 2-minute segment where Milton Friedman is talking about capitalism and free markets, and talking about a little bit about human frailty and human the downside, you know, that when people about ordering societies. Let's take a listen.
When you see around the globe the maldistribution of wealth, the desperate plight of millions of people in underdeveloped countries, when you see so few haves and so many have-nots, when you see the greed and the concentration of power within, did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea to run on?
Well, first of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed? You think Russia doesn't run on greed? You think China doesn't run on greed? What is greed? Of course, none of us are greedy. It's only the other fellow who's greedy. The world runs on individuals pursuing their separate interests. The great achievements of civilization have not come from government bureaus. Einstein didn't construct his theory under order from a bureaucrat. Henry Ford didn't revolutionize the automobile industry that way. In the only cases in which the masses have escaped from the kind of grinding poverty you're talking about, the only cases in recorded history are where they have had capitalism and largely free trade. If you want to know where the masses are worst off, it's exactly in the kinds of societies that depart from that. So that the record of history is absolutely crystal clear that there is no alternative way so far discovered of improving the lot of the ordinary people that can hold a candle to the productive activities that are unleashed by a free enterprise system.
But it seems to reward not virtue as much as ability to manipulate the system.
And what does reward virtue? You think the communist commissar rewards virtue? You think a Hitler rewards virtue? You think, excuse me, if you'll pardon me, do you think American presidents reward virtue? Do they choose their appointees on the basis of the virtue of the people appointed or on the basis of their political clout? Is it really true that political self-interest is nobler somehow than economic self-interest? You know, I think you're taking a lot of things for granted. And just tell me where in the world you find these angels who are going to organize society for us. Well, I don't even trust you to do that.
So the point is that when we start putting people in there with their own agendas, with their own human frailties, with their own psychological issues, and we expect them to act in a way that's going to be beneficial for everyone except for themselves and put everybody in front of them except for themselves, this just isn't consistent with how human beings normally act. You know, there's a story in the Bible about when Satan tempted Christ. He took him up on top of the Temple Mount and said, all you have to do to have all of this is bow down and worship me. And he was the only man that could resist that. If any of us were taken up there and told we would be given control of the entire world and all we had to do was bow down and worship Satan, people would do it. Absolutely they would. People, you know, want to get wealthy. People want to have power. You know, not everybody, of course, but, you know, a lot of people will not turn that down. And now you're going to say, well, you can print as much money as you want. You can monetize as much debt because you're doing it for a good reason. Everybody will have health care, or we're going to have the Green New Deal, or we're going to have tax cuts, or whatever, however they're going to justify it. I mean, how can you create something out of nothing? I mean, I've said this before. How much does it really cost to print a dollar bill? I don't know, 1/100 of a cent if you do them in volumes. How much does it cost to create $1 billion out of nothing and buy government debt from the government? It's a computer exercise. I mean, where does the Federal Reserve get the money, the dollars, to buy the government debt? Now, the government will, when this program goes, and even today, goes out and buys real things. They buy jets. They send checks to Social Security pensioners who buy real products. But where does the money come from? When you're running a $1 trillion deficit, you're just printing it out of thin air. So you're buying value, energy, people's labor for nothing. And at some point, I mean, you can do that as the effects of deflation and inflation wrestle. But if you do that on a large scale and create trillions and trillions of currency units and put them into the real economy, you are going to have a problem. You cannot create prosperity out of nothing. It takes sweat of the brow. It takes energy. It takes labor. It takes materials. It cannot be done for nothing. And you cannot create wealth out of nothing. Yet they're going to try. And they are going to justify it, just like they justify all their other depredations. So, you know, we already have Japan at zero bound. That means they're already at zero rates on their central bank. And they've been monetizing debt for years. I mean, some days there is no bid for Japanese government securities because the government owns all of them just about. I think they own like 97% of them. You know, Europe and the ECB is at the zero bound. They've got all kinds of issues in Europe. I mean, you can see what's going on there. That's a disaster. You know, that's primed for this whole new experiment. And after we have this new next rate cutting cycle, I suspect, which we probably have begun. I mean, Chairman Powell and the rest of the Fed have already pulled back from raising rates any further. There's almost 100% based on Fed funds futures certainty that we're going to have a cut in July of Fed funds rate. So the next time we go down to zero, we probably won't be able to get off the zero bound. And then we see this political zeitgeist that's changing where Everybody is a sloth and doesn't want to work for anything and doesn't want to be responsible. So there are those politicians that are willing to step up and say, we'll give you something for nothing. All you have to do is put me in power because I want to be in power. I want to be president and I'll give you free health care. I want to be president and I'll forgive your college loan debt. I want to be president and but we don't have the money. We can't raise taxes because people are already maxed out. We can't raise, it's just, so what will we do? Well, we have a bunch of academics, PhDs, that have told us we can follow modern monetary theory, and all we have to do is put these uncorruptible angels in there to run it for us. I just showed you that video. That doesn't exist. So, long story short, QE plus physical spending, which is monetary policy 3, that will be spent on infrastructure, free health care, pension bailouts for the states, which is about $5 trillion for the public employee pensions that are underwater, student loan forgiveness, Social Security and Medicare, Green New Deal, tax cuts, etc. Means trillions and trillions in new currency units being created. I do think, though, that we are at the bottom of a hard asset and commodity cycle, and I think this is going to be good for hard assets and commodities, and that's the actionable advice that comes out of this, is that when these governments get done printing the trillions and trillions of dollars or yen or euros of currency units, and they try to buy real assets with it, it's just like anything else. Too much of a good thing is a bad thing. And if you let this thing get out of control, which it can very easily, I mean, you can't buy anything with Venezuelan bolivars outside of Venezuela. You can barely buy anything inside the country. It's the same thing with Zimbabwe when they had their hyperinflation. No one outside the country would accept them for anything. So at some point it can be a problem. So we'll see how it develops. There's no guarantees, of course, but it's something to keep on in your mind, because politics and policies that governments put into place, they have so involved in the economy and intertwined themselves that they have an effect. So it's something we need to keep an eye on, and because it can affect what we do, and it can give us an edge, and it can give us some insight that allows us to put actionable trades in place to take advantage. So that's it for this week, guys. I look forward to the comments. Happy to talk about this more. There's a lot more reading to do on this. I'm going to put some links into the show notes. I suggest you read the articles and take a look at it, because I think this is where we're heading. And it's kind of unfortunate as far as I'm concerned, but hey, we don't make the rules here. We just try to play them and maximize them to our advantage. So that's it for this week, guys. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you next week.